When World War I began in August of 1914, the rival armies charged into battle with frightening new weapons that seemed ready to change the very nature of war. Machine guns that fired up to 600 rounds a minute into enemy troops. Giant cannons that hurled explosive shells into targets 120 kilometers away. And submarines that launched torpedoes and terror into ships at sea. But one promising new piece of military hardware wasn't quite ready to hit its mark.
Airplanes were still flimsy little machines in the development stage, really.
In fact, if you look at the airplanes at the time, they were happy with any machine that got into the air at all.
But that didn't stop a few passionate advocates from making big plans for airplanes, or from dreaming up ways to use them in war.
There are these visionaries who insist that they really have a window into the future and that the future is about airplanes.
By the end of the war, these visionaries would transform the flimsy airplanes of 1914 into powerful and dependable weapons and take war where it had rarely gone before, beyond the two-dimensional realm of our planet's surface, into the third dimension of the air above.
You can't fight on the ground on the Western Front without the airplane above you. So war has entered another dimension, and you have to continue to prepare for that dimension, whether you like it or not.
After World War I, battles would never again be fought on land or sea alone. They would have to be fought in the air, too, making every war a war in the third dimension. Most military airplanes were still struggling to get off the ground when World War I started. But another high-flying weapon was already casting a menacing shadow. The giant airships the Germans called Zeppelins.
The Germans sensed that the Zeppelin would be the truly wonder weapon of the war. In fact, it was touted as an incredible achievement of German science and technology, something to be emulated. And these giant balloons, it's almost hard to imagine one if you haven't seen them, but they're much larger than a football field. The Zeppelins will reach almost 700 feet in length.
These massive airships didn't just drift in the wind. They had powerful engines, propellers, and steering mechanisms that allowed them to travel wherever their pilots wanted to go. This freedom of movement made Zeppelins especially terrifying to Germany's neighbors, who knew that airships had been playing a growing role in war ever since men first went aloft in balloons in the 1780s. Balloons had been used in the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Civil War to get a clear view of rival forces. In the 1870s, during the Franco-Prussian War, they had been used to drop the first bombs. Now, the giant Zeppelins seemed to threaten destruction on a scale never seen before.
Just before the war, there had been a lot of what we nowadays call science fiction about invasion from the air and doomsday scenarios. And the Zeppelins at the time could fly at a height and bomb basically with impunity.
But by the time the war began in 1914, Zeppelins no longer had the air to themselves. Just 11 years after the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, the airplane was starting to come into its own, and a debate had begun over whether or not planes could ever rival the mighty Zeppelins, or even play any important role in battle.
There had been a lot of speculation about what one could do with airplanes, both on the battlefield and beyond the battlefield, but no one had really resolved that question. So it was still wide open in terms of what could they do, how advanced could they become technologically, how reliable could they become.
Some refused to believe that the primitive, unreliable airplane would ever be more than a toy.
Throughout the early phases of the war, you always had individual commanders who just could not accustom themselves to the notion that this new winged vehicle would have any impact. Field Marshal Foch, he was General Foch at the time before the war, had said, "L'avion c'est zéro." In other words, the airplane, it's worth zero, it's worth nothing.
Planes would remain nothing until they could prove themselves in battle. Till then, it would be the Zeppelin that struck fear into men and women across Europe, and especially in the British Isles.
The fear of Zeppelins actually reaches the level of a mania. The one thing the British had always said was that their island, since 1066, had been impervious to attack. Now, the Germans threatening to bomb the daylights out of it with Zeppelins, everyone realizes that they are vulnerable.
On May 31st, 1915, these fears struck home when a single Zeppelin appeared in the sky over London. By the time it left, 7 people had been killed by incendiary bombs, 35 had been injured, and parts of the city were ablaze. The British sent their planes into the air to fight back, but discovered that the Zeppelin was too high up and too far away to catch. As more of the frightening airships appeared over London over the next few weeks, it became clear that the English planes were outmatched.
The Zeppelins at the time had a rudimentary oxygen system for the crew, and they could cruise at 19 to 21,000 feet. It was difficult for the British with their airplanes to get to those heights.
The fighters that are trying to intercept those Zeppelins don't really have the engine capacity to be able to intercept them in a timely way. So the Zeppelins are getting in and getting out before the fighters can really do anything very serious about them.
But the British knew that the giant airships had a fatal weakness: the explosive hydrogen gas that kept them aloft. Developing weapons that could exploit this weakness became one of the English Army's top priorities.
The difficulty the British had, if they did detect Zeppelins, did get aircraft launched in time, the airplanes managed to get to that altitude and encounter the Zeppelins. How do you shoot them down? They tried everything from rockets mounted on the interplane struts to fire at the gas bag to incendiary or tracer rounds fired from the machine guns.
Finally, the British began to develop airplanes and weapons that were up to the job.
The defenders master the techniques of defending the territory by improving the engines and by developing these weapons that are specifically designed to make Zeppelins extremely vulnerable, which that's precisely what they achieve. And so we end up with the crumpled heaps of Zeppelin skeletons all over Britain by the fall of 1916.
The Zeppelin's brief reign as monarch of the sky was coming to an end, and it seemed as though a new king, the airplane, was about to be crowned. But it wasn't just the fall of the Zeppelins that led to the airplane's rise. Planes had started proving their value as early as September 1914, when a French pilot on a reconnaissance mission made an observation that helped to turn the tide of the war. By then, German troops had already swarmed across Belgium and into northern France and seemed ready to march right into Paris. But as the pilot flew over the front lines, he made a surprising discovery. Instead of heading straight into Paris as the French had expected, the Germans were turning east to surround the city first.
When the German army turns to the east of Paris, it exposes its flank to attack from the French army, along with the British army. And it is aerial reconnaissance that discovers this turn to the east, and that's what enables the French to attack the Germans in the Battle of the Marne, and that's what's going to transform the war from a war of movement to a trench war on the Western Front.
Paris had been saved, and aerial reconnaissance had made it all possible.
It became clear that airplanes gave you a tremendous advantage in terms of being able to see what the enemy was doing. This instantly made clear that airplanes are vital elements of modern warfighting and that you have to have them.
Aerial reconnaissance was just the beginning. The rush was on to develop new planes and new ways to use them. Because none of the warring states had a separate air force, it was up to each nation's navy or army to get the job done. For the generals running the armies, A top priority was transforming planes into tactical weapons that could provide direct support to the troops on the front lines.
By late 1914, the French had developed bombers simply that would carry an artillery shell that they had put fins on, and they would pick the shell up and drop it over the side of the plane. You also have ground strafing aircraft now. These are planes that are specifically developed to fly low over the trenches. They're two-seat fighters. The Germans do this best of all. And they fly so low over the trenches in their strafing runs that they fly underneath the arc of the shells. It's very important to the war effort because the main aim is to support the army. That's what has to be kept in mind at all times.
But as planes proved themselves as weapons, they started to become targets too. Learning how to defend your planes and the airspace they flew in soon emerged as a key element of the war.
If you don't have control over your own airspace, the enemy can see exactly what you're doing. The enemy can come in and fly in and attack your long-range artillery, attack your machine gun positions. They can potentially fly to your homeland. You've got to figure out how to defend your own airspace.
This struggle to defend the airspace over the front lines would give birth to a whole new form of combat.
The one thing that no one had thought about, really, was aerial combat. In other words, air-to-air combat. You have men on opposing sides flying over the lines and seeing each other and thinking, why should I let him fly without trying to impede his mission? And then they start carrying rifles, pistols. Some people even have the idea, why don't we drag a long hook on a wire and hook his plane, which would have brought both planes down. So you have some really incredible ideas.
A better idea came from a Dutch plane designer named Anthony Fokker, who was working for the Germans. In 1915, Fokker mounted a machine gun directly in front of the pilot. Then he discovered a way to make it fire through the propeller without hitting the spinning blades. Now pilots no longer had to fly in one direction while shooting in another. They just pointed their plane at the enemy and pulled the trigger. It wasn't long before flyers on both sides of the war were using Fokker's new invention to deadly effect, and figuring out even more ways to triumph over their enemies in the air.
And the pilots themselves are in an intense competition with one another to learn maneuvers, to learn tactics. And they do this with all the adaptability and all the athleticism that human beings typically muster in new situations. And they prove themselves capable of developing tactics very quickly. And they move from individual tactics to group tactics, which are in many circumstances more effective. They develop different spins and escape mechanisms and attack mechanisms. And as airplanes become faster and more maneuverable, there's more they can do with them. They're pushing the envelope, the technological envelope of these weapons all the time.
Their daring exploits would win the pilots fame as the aces of the air, fearless flyers who soared to glory above the increasingly faceless and brutal combat in the trenches below.
Especially on the Western Front, it was such a slow, terrible slog, such a miserable war where the whole element of the individual warrior seemed to have disappeared out of warfare entirely. The one place where the old notions of nobility surrounding warfare and chivalry and knighthood and heroism seemed to be preserved was in the air, where you still had individual battles, where you still had the competition between one skilled pilot and another skilled pilot who seemed to be on roughly equal terms with one another. And it's a kind of best man can win environment. But also it was good for public morale to make the fighter pilots into heroes, because the people back home needed heroes.
French aces would often comment that when they went to Paris, young women were constantly putting telephone numbers and addresses in their pockets. They couldn't go anywhere without essentially being recognized and worshiped. They're, in a sense, movie stars.
But back above the battlefield, the aces faced challenges few of their fans on the ground could even imagine.
The stress of aerial combat, first of flying in airplanes, but then of aerial combat, is ferocious. It takes an incredible toll on the men who do it.
We have a very romantic notion of the fighter pilot, but this is an environment in which life is very violent, very brutal, and often very short. Many of the aces were flying frequently injured, many of them seriously injured, and not that many of them lived from the beginning of the war all the way through to the end of the war.
12 of the war's top 20 aces died in battle. 3/4 of Britain's pilots were either lost in combat or rendered unable to fly due to injuries or mental strain. But generals on both sides refused to let their pilots wear parachutes until the last year of the war. They worried that the terrified flyers would be too eager to jump.
You don't leave the front after a certain number of missions. There's no tour of duty. You fly until you are either killed, invalided out, or have a nervous breakdown.
The brutality reached new heights in 1916 during two epic battles, at the Somme and Verdun. As hundreds of thousands of their countrymen died below, the pilots began to develop a new thirst for vengeance. The last traces of chivalry died away.
It's now beyond the early days when pilots might wave at each other when they'd fly by, or, goodness, if the other man ran out of bullets, you'd be gallant and wave at him and leave him alone. No more. The French and the Germans are out for blood. In fact, at Verdun, one Frenchman commented that he had riddled the German from so close on his tail that the blood had come out of the German's cockpit and almost blinded his goggles, and he said the taste was delicious.
But as the battles at Verdun and the Somme turned into stalemates in both the trenches and in the air, the debate began over whether the aces' blood sacrifices had been worthwhile. The answer seemed to be both yes and no.
In terms of its defensive role in being able to prevent the Germans from doing even more damage than they would have been able to do unfettered, it does have an important impact.
The difficulty is that it's moving increasingly to be a mass war of attrition, just like the war on the ground. And when that happens, it means that it's going to take more than one squadron to maintain aerial supremacy over the front.
Germany, Great Britain, and France had less than 1,500 planes when the war began. Before it was over, they would build 175,000 more and lose 116,000 in battle. Keeping up with the demand would strain their aircraft factories to the breaking point. But the planes kept coming, and the generals running the war kept figuring out new ways to use them. Some hoped they could take the fighting to a frightening new place, far away from the battle, to the enemy's home front. They called it strategic bombing.
There is a formidable group of advocates in each air arm who say the plane needs to be developed more for strategic purposes. The bombing of enemy cities, the bombing of enemy factories that supply the front.
This notion that, maybe you could just leap right over all this battlefield stuff and go directly to the enemy's vital centers, directly to the heart of the enemy, that's a revolutionary thing.
You could end the war decisively with knockout blows, which would have two effects: one against the morale, the spirit, the will to win of the population, and also the destruction of the armaments and poison gas factories that supported the war machine of your adversary.
But could strategic bombing really have such a profound impact? Once again, the skies over London would be a crucial proving ground.
The first raid on London occurred on a beautiful June day, clear sky, and these planes appeared, and they were flying in formation. I think there was 17 planes, and they were painted white. And most of the people thought it was some kind of aerial display. And the people just looked up and stared and said, "How wonderful, they're ours." And then suddenly the bombs started to fall.
The Germans had returned, but this time, instead of the vulnerable Zeppelins, they were coming in powerful new planes.
You get the Germans using twin-engine Gotha bombers, and then in 1917 and 1918, what they call Riesenflugzeuge, R planes, giant planes, having as many as 6 engines, to bomb London because they're trying to knock the British out of the war.
They had this concept of Schrecklichkeit, which is frightfulness. And they thought they could awe the London populace. You relate that to contemporary events, it's shock and awe, if you remember that expression.
Rudolf Kleine, the German officer in charge of the London bombing, was sure he could terrorize the British people into demanding that their government withdraw from the war.
Late September, probably October, he raided London on 6 of 8 nights and drove the populace into the underground, the British subway. So this scene of World War II, where everybody takes their pet canary and their bedding and goes to spend the night in the subway, happened in World War I. Kleine thought if he could keep that up, that the British morale would break.
But Kleine and the rest of the Germans had overestimated the impact of bombing on civilians and underestimated their resilience under fire. Instead of giving up, the British began demanding revenge.
There's a tremendous amount of anger after the London raids in 1917, in part because some of the bombs hit a kindergarten. And that just produces tremendous indignation, outrage. We will not tolerate this. We have to give the Germans back some of their own medicine.
In fact, when you study the documents and the newspapers and the letters home at that time, the word reprisal is used ubiquitously.
You get civilian members of the government who are saying, "We really would like to torch that German town to teach the Hun a lesson."
To exact these reprisals, the British created the Royal Air Force, the first all-aviation military corps to operate independently of a nation's army or navy. But as England and Germany pounded away at each other in the world's first strategic bombing war, one thing became clear. Neither side had the technology to really pull it off. World War I pilots had no radar to guide them, were frequently grounded by bad weather, and had a hard time finding targets in the dark, the safest time to fly.
It's very difficult to locate a target at night. And even as late as 1918, when they examined the Royal Air Force bombing patterns, it was discovered the Royal Air Force could not hit a large town with any accuracy as late as the end of the war.
And on top of all of that, 20 to 30% of the bombs dropped by the British, even if they did fall on the targets, were blinds, what we would call duds. And it can be very demoralizing to haul a load of bombs into Germany through the defenses and then find out that over a third of them don't detonate as you'd hoped.
The notion that you can bomb enemy cities, that you can panic civilians, you can frighten them sufficiently to overthrow the government, is far in advance of anything the airplane is capable of in the First World War. The ideas of strategic aviation, if you actually set out to implement them, lead to a great deal of frustration and disappointment because you don't drive anyone out of the war.
But in spite of their limited technology, the aerial warriors of World War I had come up with the ideas and theories that would guide combat in the third dimension from then on.
By the end of the war, a lot of the ideas about how to use the airplane in warfare had been worked out, and worked out with a great deal of sophistication.
You have come from a situation in 1914 where people were dubious whether the airplane would play any role at all. And by 1918, they know that you can't fight on the ground, you can't conduct the war without the airplane above you.
The legacy of World War I/II military aviation was finally a belated recognition of the importance of the third dimension and what could be accomplished by mastery, superiority, supremacy in that dimension.
Over the course of the 20th century, the airplanes of the First World War would evolve into jets and rockets, satellites and spaceships. But the lessons of that first air war would remain. War had entered the third dimension and would never leave it again.